Hello and welcome to episode number 40 of Reclaim Today, which is crazy to think of. And I am here joined by a group that's going to talk to us a little bit about a project called Documenting Exclusion and Resilience. And I am going to let each of these fine folks introduce themselves, starting with you, Janine.
Hi, I'm Janine DeWitt. I'm trained in sociology and taught at Marymount for about 30 years. I recently became a professor emerita to work primarily on my research.
And hi, I'm Kristen Moon. I'm a professor of history and American studies at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I do a lot of public history work, and that's how I come to this project.
Hi, I'm Kristen Noon, and I spent about 30 years in the federally assisted housing arena as a lawyer and as a policy advocate. I did mostly FHA and HUD work across the country, and I linked up into this project through my master's work at Marymount University, where I met Janine DeWitt, and this combined all my interests, history, and my experience as a housing lawyer.
And my name is Matt Bacher. I am an associate professor of sociology at Marymount University, and my specialty is in transnational migration and community development. And I've primarily worked on this project due to my ability to work with geospatial data and to help the team to connect their historical research to contemporary geospatial data sets.
Great. Thank you all for not only doing the hard work of introducing for me, but also for joining us today for this discussion. So one of the things I guess would be valuable is to kind of lay out in broad strokes, what exactly is the Documenting Exclusion and Resilience project? Can we give a kind of brief description of what it is and how it came to be?
Who wants to take that on?
Go for it, Kristen.
Okay. So this project, in many ways, is what I call an active serendipity. That Janine and Kristen and myself were doing similar work in different jurisdictions, and we realized that we should come together and work as a team to help document the pervasiveness of racially restrictive covenants on the landscape here in Northern Virginia, but also want to acknowledge the resilience and grit of African Americans facing this literal landscape and how they navigated those racial politics in the early to mid 20th century. Do folks have anything else they want to add? Is that good enough?
No, that's great. The only thing I would add is my interest in this stemmed from conversations with my colleagues, Matt and Delario, about how place matters. And someone in the team asked a very simple question about the pervasiveness of racial covenants in Arlington. And that spurred my curiosity to go down in what ended up to be a long and winding road.
I might encourage Kristen Noon to draw on that legal expertise to talk a little bit about what racially restrictive covenants are.
Right. What do they mean?
Yeah.
So a racially restrictive covenant is basically an agreement, a legal document that is recorded in the land records of any particular jurisdiction. It's where it's often in deeds of one form or another. It could be in a individual we call them bargain and sale deeds in Virginia, but they're called different. They have different names in different in different states. And those could be between individual parties selling a particular parcel of land. In other cases, they are included in what we call deeds of dedication. Those were the documents that were recorded that basically formed whole subdivisions. So those could be anywhere from 5 lots to 105 lots, and those covenants were placed on the every lot. By putting that covenant in the dedication document, that covenant then racially restricted all the lots in the subdivision, and so these legal documents are on the records, and in probably the majority of the cases still remain on the records. There have been a few that have been removed or amended in some way, but oftentimes people don't even realize that they have a covenant on their property, because it's not like your individual deeds have repeated those covenants. They use cross references that wouldn't be meaningful. They're illegal now. The 1968 Fair Housing Act made them illegal, so they are not enforceable in any form or fashion.
So if they're not enforceable and they're still there, one of the things I read about when I was reading a little bit about an article that Kristen Moon was discussing is um, how do you kind of track that? They're able to be removed potentially, but the danger of that is maybe removing the archive of some of these and being able to track that. I mean, in terms of this project, how do you understand kind of putting those pieces together to tell a story about this history and what needs to preserve to tell that story well?
So there's sort of two different issues, I think, from your question. One is like the archival process and how to take that process, which tends to be more qualitative, and make something quantitative and actually mappable, right? And so to do that, every jurisdiction is different, and you have to sort of figure out what they do to, process their records and then use that to then find the covenants in that jurisdiction. So that's a tedious process. You're like digging deed by deed sometimes in these books and trying to get a sense of patterns in the landscape, where to look, where not to look, etc. In terms of the second part, there is a process in the state of Virginia, and again, every state is different, but you can have them removed. They have an expedited process to do that. It in many ways is a symbolic gesture because, of course, as Kristen mentioned, they're actually illegal per the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And as such, the removal process doesn't necessarily erase it from the historical record. It's more of an acknowledgement that that restriction no longer applies to that particular parcel of land. And so one of the things that's been important to us is actually educating people about that process. And if they're interested to pursue that gesture with their own property. Do folks have other things they want to add?
I might just mention that there are groups like ourselves, each group across the country of researchers, sort of approaches this whole issue in a slightly different way, but there are many common threads. And I think that sort of a uniform belief is that you could remove those covenants and sort of obliterate them from the records, but that is not something that I think uniformly researchers across the country would advocate, because erasing history isn't something that makes historical research very very helpful. So and there's a host of other obvious reasons for retaining them, and that is something that each state has to grapple with in terms of how you would retain the information without completely just erasing and eliminating that historical record. And so some Virginia will do it differently, as Kristen pointed out, than for perhaps Washington State or Minnesota or California. But we're all grappling with that sort of thing.
And I read in the article, which is in Alexandria Now, or ALX Now, is it's happening, and they're talking about it in Alexandria, and there was some funding, and there was a push to have this done, which would be interesting to hear more about. But I mean, how widespread beyond Alexandria is this, not only in terms of Virginia, but beyond?
So Alexandria, I think, is unique in the sense that it was the Department of Housing and Zoning who came to me and asked to help document this phenomenon within the city. I don't know of any other instances in the state of Virginia or even really nationally where it's being driven, not even by a history office, it's being driven by the office in charge of housing to document this. And part of it was that the staff in the Department of Housing and Zoning had been going through some training, and that they realized that they needed a context, a historical context, to understand why things are the way they are, and that our built environment isn't just because, right, that there were intentions, right, to include and exclude people based upon a variety of issues, race being one of them, but also class. Class is a huge force in terms of suburban development in Northern Virginia. And so that's sort of how this started, was to help inform decisions in terms of policy in the present, which for me was really interesting because normally I think about history in sort of an encapsulated way, right, that it's about history for history's sake, not necessarily informing present and future policy. Now, that said, there are other jurisdictions where you do see government invested in this process. So in North Carolina, the Recorder of Deeds is very much in one jurisdiction that we've been talking to involved in this process. In the state of Washington, the legislature is actually funding a statewide project to document racially restricted covenants. So you do see that sort of connection between history and current policy, but it seems to be sort of scattershot throughout the country. It's not systematic in any way.
I wonder if I could interject really with a question for the rest of you, but it's so, Kristen, you were just pointing out that in Alexandria, the Department of Housing was interested in providing some historical context to the contemporary housing landscape. Can you tell us a little bit more about that historical context? How common were these racially restrictive covenants in Northern Virginia? What's the rationale for their use in the early to mid 20th century?
So at least I'll speak to Alexandria, and then maybe Janine and Kristen can speak about Arlington. In Alexandria, it's really a twofold process. One, it's about offering quote unquote modern housing and what people believed modern housing to look like. And so they would target certain areas where they're trying to focus on white middle class families to move into. So you do see that phenomenon, number one. And then number two, it's also a strategy to manage and shrink, in many cases, African-American neighborhoods, and that they create these sort of borders, sort of firm lines around African-American neighborhoods. In Alexandria, it gets really interesting, though, because you do see that in areas to the west and north of the city, but in the oldest sections of the city where the neighborhoods are much more amorphous and mixed racially and in terms of class, this practice doesn't actually emerge at all. So we see it in the more modern subdivisions, and modern meaning like 1900 through 1950s, right? So not some of the 18th century housing stock that a place like Alexandria has. Janine and Kristen, did you want to talk a little bit more about Arlington? Because I think it's somewhat different than Alexandria.
Sure. Janine, do you want to, or do you want me to jump in?
Go ahead. I'm having technical difficulties, so I'm hoping that I've just solved them, but go ahead.
You have solved them, Janine.
I did? Okay. All right. What I would say in Arlington is that we don't have all the data yet, and so it's really difficult to identify how the covenants were distributed across the county. We started with deeds of dedication and looked at existing subdivisions and thought, wow, that's pervasive. And then realized in the process that not only were covenants placed on properties when they dedicated a subdivision, but they also placed them on properties when they sold parcels within a subdivision. And we're in the midst of doing that research now and finding that there are probably as many covenants in that regard as well. So we're still in process, and we're still trying to figure out the distribution of the covenants. So
What's interesting about Arlington in what we've pulled so far, and we are, as long as we've worked on this, I feel like we're really somewhat in the early part of it, is that the sort of notion of there's certainly, and I think part of this is a class-based view of Arlington. North Arlington is viewed as an area that tends to have more money. South Arlington is viewed as more of an immigrant population, et cetera, or those who have less money. And that there, a lot of times people, when they think about Arlington, they sort of, if you're from Arlington, you sort of think about a divide of North Arlington and South Arlington, West and East, and all of that. And what we've noticed so far is that no matter where we sort of spot and start and do pieces of our research, these covenants show up. It doesn't seem to matter, at least at this point, whether we're in North Arlington, South Arlington, East Arlington, or West Arlington, or in the middle. There's a wide range of them.
Hey, Jim, I'm going to ask Matt a question because I want to make sure we talk about what he's been doing, because one of the things is like, we can talk archives all day, but to make this material and real for people and also to see that pervasiveness is really what Matt's been doing with developing our map. And I was hoping, Matt, that you could talk about what we're doing in terms of our map and some of the hurdles that you've had with the information we've given you, and like all the things that are working great and not working great, et cetera, for your part of the process.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So the broader project at this point, I think is working with racially restrictive covenants in 4 separate jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. So we've got Arlington County, the city of Alexandria, but also the city of Falls Church and the city of Fairfax thus far. And I think there's some intention of expanding that as well to the county of Fairfax as well in the near future. But given the fact that we're dealing with these 4 separate jurisdictions, there has been 4 different processes for linking the covenants that are found either on entire subdivisions or individual parcels to contemporary land parcels. And so what I've really done is to try and find ways for us to link the documents that the rest of the team has identified to the geospatial data sets that are available through each of the 4 jurisdictions of every one of the parcels within their jurisdiction. In some cases, that has been easier than in others. In some cases, we knew from the outset what the property code for the parcel was, and it was as simple as simply doing a database join between the database that we had with recording the covenant and the geospatial data set that we got from the jurisdiction. In other cases, it was a little bit more difficult because we knew not what the actual property code was from individual parcels that a covenant, particularly a subdivision covenant, applied to, but instead we knew some of the technical details about a particular subdivision, say the name of the subdivision, a section of a subdivision or a block within a subdivision that covenant applied to. And then we had to go through the process of trying to identify each contemporary parcel that fits within that subdivision block and section. And so there was quite a bit of work that we went through, and this was particularly in the case of Arlington, to try and parse the information from the county's land records that have a legal description within the data set to try and identify subdivision parcel, block, and section, and then use that information to merge with our data set. So I'll say that's kind of been the most challenging part of the work that I've done. But once we were able to do that, to actually have created this geospatial data set in 4 jurisdictions, identifying covenants, what we did then was to try and find a way that we could effectively create maps that were fast enough to load on the website. And this is, I think, where we really benefited from working with you all at Reclaim, in that we used Reclaim as a way to actually. So I'm going to get into some technical details here, but what we did was to run an instance, a Docker container of a Postgres or PostGIS database. We uploaded our geospatial data set to that Postgres database. And then we ran another Docker container with a tile server service that is called PG Tile Serve that creates vector tiles on the fly for us. And then we used those vector tiles to feed directly into our web page, and have generated a rather quick map that is interactive. People can scroll in on particular areas of Northern Virginia and identify the areas where these covenants apply. They can click on a particular parcel. We have a pop-up that comes up that provides some specific information about the covenant applying to that property. So that would be things like the date that the covenant was first recorded, the restrictive language that's contained in the covenant. I think that's what I can say at the moment.
Yeah. And I will say, since Jim's pulled up our website, our map is not there yet, because we want to have some members of the community see it first and talk with us about that data, and sort of make sure that what we are doing reflects some of their questions or concerns, et cetera. So this is going to be the space where it is going to be built out. And we know that it works. We're going to use, hopefully our theme will be friendly with us. We'll use like an iframe code to basically connect the data that Matt has created in our Docker to the website. So you can see everything else is ready to go on our website. And there's also information there about the history of racially restricted covenants and in Northern Virginia, different sources, secondary sources, other projects that are going on throughout the United States. And people are, new people keep on coming to this conversation, which is absolutely fabulous. It's sort of this grassroots movement here in the United States. Everybody from Tucson to Chicago to Northern Virginia to Washington State, we're all part of this conversation. So it's really a wonderful experience to be part of it.
And I might just add that part of that context that we provide and the information on restrictive covenants on the website includes, both local aspects for sure, but it also provides the national context, because locales didn't come up with this just themselves. I mean, there were many national influences on the use of covenants, including the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and the Veterans Administration with the GI Bill and other programs that facilitated housing financing in the early to mid 1900s. And so we provide information about that as well, so that people get, the whole, a broader picture of how covenants came into play, and some of the systemic nature of those covenants, using those covenants.
No, that's excellent. And it's really, hopefully I'm not interrupting anyone. Any other comments on that? No, so I just wanted to actually take a moment to thank each of you for joining us today to talk a little bit about this project, how you're mapping it. And I guess the final question is, where do you see it going? Do you see those various kind of cells of interest around the country bringing a kind of a more kind of informed movement, not only to preserve the past and learn from it, but to maybe prevent different versions of it that are happening as of now?
Anybody want to jump in? Because I'll always jump in. All right, I will jump in. So I can see this play out in lots of different ways. Of course, I think collaboration across the United States would be critical, and like the growth of this movement, which is both about documenting but also educating the broader public, often in digital ways. Most of the folks who we're talking with are also building websites and building maps throughout the United States. So that's really wonderful to see. But also taking, at least for me, taking some of this into the classroom, working with students in other communities in Virginia where this phenomenon is occurring. So one of my goals this spring is to work with our geography faculty, with a small number of students, advanced students, and start documenting and mapping this phenomenon in Fredericksburg, where our school is, and to look around the neighborhood around our school to see if this is happening there. And if so, to have students start talking amongst themselves, talk with the community, maybe talk with city officials about the impact of that phenomenon where the University of Mary Washington is. So I think you can think about it in this really big picture way, right? But also taking it and doing other things on a very much local level.
Yeah, I would really echo what Kristen has just said here. I mean, I think that as I understand it, and I'm not a historian, but instead a sociologist, but it does seem to me that there has been, a vibrant body of research and set of debates amongst historians about the various players and agencies involved in the widespread use of these racially restrictive covenants in the 20th century, identifying both federal agencies, local political officials, but also local and national real estate interests who promulgated these types of restrictions. But I think that what is particularly valuable and interesting about this project and the national network of others that are doing this is that we're really trying to create a public face to this, right? To move outside of academia and the vibrant historical debates and really engage with the public. And I think that in as much as this conversation leads us to really reckoning with the past and the way in which the past informs and impacts the present, the significant racial wealth gap that we experience in the United States, much of which is at least, let's say, directly related to home ownership, as home ownership has been one of the primary means of wealth development in the United States over the last century. It can lead us in our communities to consider what responsibilities we have for the past, and the way in which past public policies and private actions have created the highly unequal society that we live in today.
And I would add to it that I think in terms of big picture and how these projects move forward, it is both a challenge to us on the local level as with our local project, in how we can maximize the use of the research that we're doing. I mean, whether it's for, as Alexandria has done, use that policy or that historical information for policy consideration and thought, and information, or for education in the classroom, as far as our local history, our understanding of our local place, as Janine mentioned. But on the national level, I think there's been a number of conversations and people sort of noodling, how to bring these projects together in a more cohesive manner, and those involve both just basic logistics issues, as you have different jurisdictions focusing, having different systems and different ways of producing and documenting and storing and processing the data, and just the demand. I mean, where do you put this data? I mean, this is huge numbers of documents, et cetera. And then how does our work inform perhaps federal policy pieces? And there have been some folks who have had discussions, Minnesota particularly, with their senators about educating them on the work that they're doing, and looking at restrictive covenant related legislation, and sort of nationalizing that approach in terms of how you would deal with perhaps removing them without removing them, and more. So I think it's an ongoing discussion, and I don't think anybody has a particular handle on it yet. But it's a live conversation across the country.
Well, it's wonderful. I want to thank each of you for spending some time with us today, talking a bit about your work and your research, and about the impact of these racially restrictive covenants and the ideas of exclusion that they undergird, and what you're all trying to do to make that known. So again, thank you for joining me. Thanks for sharing your research, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.